Hi, everyone, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and as always, it's my privilege to share this time of Bible study with you. Today, we're going to look at the second lesson in a unit of lessons titled The Fellowship of the Table. And we're looking at ways in which our fellowship times as groups of people, as churches, as friends, as family, how those enhance our relationships with one another, and likewise, our time when God speaks through each other to each of us. It's a wonderful time, and we want to see the power of that time. Certainly us Methodists love our covered dish socials. We love our times of getting together and fellowshipping, and that's one of the strengths of our church. And it is a good strength. Last week we looked at uh, a lesson entitled Shared Abundance, and we saw Jesus feeding the 5,000 and how he used that time as a symbol of God's care and concern and sharing with, uh, with people and with human beings, and just really being concerned about our physical as well as our spiritual needs. Today we're going to look at a little bit different context of fellowship and of a meal time. And the title of today's lesson is A Meal of Reconciliation. You know, sometimes when we're not getting along well, a meal can be a time when we can kind of relax a little bit, sit down with each other, and say some things in a way that we can't say them maybe in a meeting or a formal setting, and get some things resolved and work things through. So mealtime can be a time to reconcile, a time when we uh, get closer to one another in all kinds of ways. And that's what we're going to look at today from 1 Samuel, the 25th chapter, a story of David and of his relationship with a man called Nabal. Uh, just to give you a little historical perspective, we had Moses, who God uh, authenticated as the leader of the people to bring them out of Egypt and to lead them through their 40 years in the wilderness. Then, as they uh, started to cross over and enter into the promised land, Joshua assumed the leadership, and he worked with the people through that time of settling the land, of just settling boundaries and having the different tribes designated different areas and that sort of thing. After Joshua, there was a period where just each clan, each tribe had its own tribal leader, and we call this the period of the judges. And the judges made those decisions and were the kind of the government authority or kind of the ruler of the group. And the people became dissatisfied with this, and they came to Samuel, who was the prophet at the time and who was uh, God's spokesman, and they said, Samuel, we'd like to have a king like the other people around us have kings. So Samuel approached God about this, and God said, okay. And he told Samuel to go and to uh, uh, anoint Saul to be the king of Israel, of all the Jews. And this was all good. The people were happy. They had a king. The judges had someone they had to answer to. It kind of established a new range of checks and balances in their system, and everybody was happy with that. And except that, as time went on, Saul proved himself not to be the best of kings. He lacked insight into a lot of things. Kings, like pastors, like leaders in any situation, have their strengths and have their weaknesses. And uh, Saul was weak in some areas where it really hindered his leadership ability. Because of this, God told Samuel to anoint David to be the next king. Well, Saul was still on the throne, but David had been anointed to be the next king. And so there's that conflict, that tension between the two. And certainly this hit a high point when David, as a military leader of the people, came marching in with his troops from a won victory, and the people started singing this song where they said, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And certainly Saul got very frustrated about that and started to attack David, and David had to flee. And he had a band of men who went with him, and they were kind of on the run during this time of transition between Saul and David. That's where this story takes up. David and his men are involved with the people. They have a role with the people, but it's not the direct role of king and leader. We find during this time, David and his men did come to the aid of one of the Jewish communities that were being attacked by the Philistines, and he overcame that, became the protector of them. Also during this time, David and his men offered protection to shepherds and others that were in the area where they were at. Shepherds were very vulnerable. They weren't warriors. They were shepherds. They were herdsmen. They were people who took care of the sheep. And certainly sheep have such a tendency to wander and that sort of thing. And if you had 3,000, as we'll see in a moment, that would certainly take a lot of men to do that. And so they would be very preoccupied with just taking care of the sheep. And so it was good to have somebody like David and his band of men who would kind of watch out for you and make sure that other people, because sometimes people of other groups would come in and try to steal some of the sheep or just do mischief. So David had done that for these people. And let's hear a little bit. Introduction, first of all, of Nabal. Nabal was a man who was he did business in Carmel, and he had taken his 3,000 sheep to Carmel to be sheared. Now that in itself gives us an indication this was a very special time. It's kind of a festival kind of time. The shearing of the sheep was a time when certainly they've been waiting for a long time for this wool to grow out and reach a point where they could cut it off of the sheep when the seasons were appropriate for the sheep not to have this heavy coat of wool. And all that fit together. And so it was a time of celebrating. It's like a time of harvest for a farmer. And Nabal was there with his sheep. And it was typical at a time like this for the sheep owner to kind of catch up on anything that he owed other people. Lots of times, like a farmer would go to the bank and early in the spring and say, if you will advance me some money to buy my seed and fertilizer and maybe a couple of pieces of equipment I need, when my harvest comes in, I'll repay the loan. And not so much that Nabal had loans out, but he just had situations where people had done things throughout the period of time, knowing that when the time for sheep shearing came, Nabal would settle up those accounts. Well, David, in that same sort of context, sends some of his men to Nabal during this time of sheep shearing. He says to them, start out very humbly, greet him and respect his position and who he is. And verse 6, he says, say this to him, peace to you, your household, and all that is yours. I've heard that you are now shearing sheep. Shearing sheep. As you know, your shepherds were with me in the wilderness. We didn't mistreat them. Moreover, the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs went missing. In other words, we afforded them protection. We didn't take advantage of the fact that we were people who could overwhelm them physically, and they prospered and did better because they had our protection. And he sent servants to go to Nabal with this message, and he told them to say to him, he says, because we've come on a special day, this sheep shearing time, please give whatever you have on hand to your servants and to your son David. Your servants, your son David. David and his men were really humbling themselves before Nabal. They were acknowledging his position. They were not challenging his position. They were not trying to take over or anything like that. They were simply asking to be considered in the dispersing of the uh, wealth of the moment. Nabal, on the other hand, being this man who was described here in verse 3, uh, Nabal was someone who was ill tempered, and he was married to a woman named Abigail. This gives us a little hint, too, because wives are not usually mentioned, but here Abigail is going to be such a significant character in this story that she's mentioned early on. She was an intelligent and attractive woman, but her husband was a hard man who did evil things. He was a Calebite of the tribe of Caleb, the tribe of Judah, the group of Judah, so the northern kingdom. And so here's their identification. Here's who they are. You have Nabal and you have his wife Abigail. You have David and you have his men. The story, the plot thickens as we go on here. David's men came to Nabal and they said, did everything in all the appropriate ways to ask for compensation for what they had done. And Nabal's response says, here in verse 10 says, but Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is Jesse's son? There are all sorts of slaves running around from the masters these days. Why should I take my bread, my water, and meat I butchered for my shearers and give it to people who came here from who knows where? Wow, what a pow, slap in the face. Who are you to be asking anything of me? David's men had already laid out the service they had provided for Nabal and for his shepherds, the care of his sheep, and yet, you get into politics here sometimes too. Saul is still the seated king. Maybe Nabal was a man associated with Saul. And maybe he wanted to be supportive of Saul, and so he was kind of being negative towards David because even though he had heard that Samuel had anointed David to be the next king, he wasn't king yet. Saul was king. And he just saw David and his men as rebels who out doing their own thing. They were rebels, but they not by choice. Just the situation was beginning to unfold over time. But anyway, it was very insulting the way that he responded to David. And his men came back to him and told him this. David's response was the kind of response you would anticipate from a powerful man in a leadership position, not used to having his authority questioned, not used to having his request denied. David said to his soldiers, all of you, strap on your swords. So each of them strapped on their swords, and David did the same. Nearly 400 men went with David. 200 men remained back with the supplies. So David had quite a group of men, 600 men, and probably women and children along with them, and a good little group of people with David. But 400 men who were armed and experienced fighters and were ready to follow his lead and his command. And he said, put on your sword and let's go. And they take off towards Nabal and they're going to put this man in his place. The kind of response you'd expect. Not necessarily the response of a spiritual man, not necessarily the response of a very spiritually oriented Jewish person. Because, we remember the law is quite specific on how Jews are to interact with each other, the kind of relationships that they're trying to maintain with one another. In Leviticus chapter 19, we find you must not hate your fellow Israelite in your heart. You must not take revenge nor hold a grudge against any of your people. Instead, you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am. So while Nabal, what he did was not correct and certainly not appropriate, what David was about to do was not correct and fully appropriate either. Thus enters Abigail. One of Nabal's servants came to Abigail and he says, we just can't talk to Nabal. There's no way to reason with him. He's made up his mind and he's set on doing what he's done, continuing to do what he's done, and it's going to be a real calamity. He doesn't know who it is he's up against, how he's set the wheels in motion for some very terrible things to happen. Well, Abigail, this intelligent woman, this woman of insight and sensitivity to issues, responds quickly. It says in verse 18, Abigail quickly took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready for cooking, 5 shekels of roasted grain, 100 raisin cakes, and 200 fig cakes. She loaded all this on donkeys and told her servants, "Go on ahead of me. I'll be right behind you." But she didn't tell her husband, Nabal. She took action into her own hands. And my goodness, we've talked about the role of women during this time in history. This was a brazen thing for a wife to do, to assume this kind of authority and to make these kinds of responses, especially in full knowledge of what her husband's response is. But she also saw the potential to avoid disaster and to reconcile things before they got too far out of hand. So the servants with the food supplies go ahead, and as Abigail's going along, suddenly David and his men just descend on them. It's kind of like she's going along a path, and on the hillside, here comes David and his men. Uh, Send on. They have nowhere to run, nothing to do. They have to wait and discuss, see if they can work things out. Abigail is a really good negotiator, isn't she? She dismounts. She bows before David. She acknowledges him just like he had told his servants to acknowledge Nabal. And she tells him that she has brought this food, hoping to reconcile and to make up for uh, the hurt feelings, things that are going on, and, and avoid any kind of conflict. And then she shifts a moment here, and she really steps out of a woman's role because she starts talking about spiritual things. She starts talking about the Lord. She says, and remember, the Lord would not want you to do this thing that you set your mind upon to do. She referenced back to Leviticus, that passage we just talked about not holding a grudge and not doing evil to your brother Israelite, uh, those kinds of things. She says, think about it now, David. You're going against not just uh, putting your men in danger and that sort of thing over a squabble kind of a thing, but you're going against the Lord's own commandments and direction for lives. This gets David's attention. David was a man who was very spiritually sensitive. When she brought this acknowledgement of God and his will into David's mind, he recanted and he said, "You're right." And he prays to God. He says, "Thank you, Lord, for saving me from making this terrible mistake and from doing this awful thing that I don't want to do." And he puts it in God's hands. You and I so often face dilemmas in our lives where we can't work it out based on who we are, where we are, what our resources are, our situation. And so we have to give it to God. And that's what David does. He gives it to God. And he says, "Lord, I leave it up to you to work through what needs to be done." And sure enough, we find at the end of the story here what could very well be God's response to that. For Abigail goes back home, and the next day she tells her husband Nabal what she has done. And when she does, listen to what Scripture says. Uh, Nabal's heart failed inside him, and he became like a stone. After about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Boy, it creates some real mental images there, doesn't it? Maybe Nabal had a heart attack. Maybe he had a stroke. Who knows what exactly phrasing means, but nonetheless, he really was struck down by God, and God took care of it. And David saw that God, because of God's actions, he was spared from spilling innocent blood, spilling unnecessary blood. That Nabal would have been innocent, but his servants and all his family and all those people that would have been caught up in this conflict were spared. And David was relieved of that. And because of that, he even affords Abigail his protection. He asked her to marry him, to be his second wife. And as becoming his wife, he gives her the protections that a woman didn't have in this day of history. We've talked about that before, too. And she is rewarded in that sense of being wise and being someone who has good insight and knows how to act and when to act, and to be trusting in God in a special way. What a powerful message of fellowship, of how sharing, of how supporting one another, seeing our connections with others can bring about reconciliation, taking a step back from the moment, the heat of conflict, and seeing the potential, possibilities, and the basic guidelines of God's telling us to love each other as He loves us, and to allow things to work themselves out. Sometimes we need to be bold and say, I don't like that. Sometimes we need to do that, but then when the response is not as we expect it to be or hope for it to be, learn how to step back and let God take care of those things for us. Fellowship and reconciliation. The two go very closely together. It's hard to be out of reconcile with one another and yet be in fellowship. So sometimes we talk about fellowship at church in kind of a light-hearted way, and yet it is such a dynamic and powerful part of our ministry as a group of people to one another and to the world around us, where we exhibit and express a fellowship, a connection that people can know that there is other places. I hope you'll think about this as you go through your week today, this week, and think about David, all the things that he could have done, should have done, Abigail and her wisdom, Nabal and his obstinance and power and just misuse of those things. Examine yourself. I'll do the same. Because I know sometimes I step out of character too. Sometimes as a parent, I'm almost like a king and I can dictate. I need sometimes to take a step back and listen, be still, and let God direct me in how to do things. Reconciliation is a part of our fellowship with one another. If our fellowship is strong,